Good morning, everybody. We will be continuing our study into the divided kingdom again this morning. But as always, before we get started, if you would, bow with us for a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we want to thank you again for the period of study that you've put before us. Help us to dive into your word and come out of it closer to you. Pray that you would help us this morning learn to seek you and prosper as a side effect instead of trying to seek prosperity for its own sake. In your Son's name, amen. Well, we'll go ahead and get started briefly here while they work on the slides in the PowerPoint. If you didn't notice before, if you want to open up and follow along, we'll be starting today in 2 Kings in the 14th chapter. There, we'll start the 21st verse. We'll finish out that chapter and run through the first little section of chapter 15. And then we'll spend a good portion of our times back over in 2 Chronicles, which it feels like we kind of have had to step away from here for a little bit as most of the action has been in the Kings passages. We will get to dive a good bit back into the Chronicles side this morning. So just to recap a little bit, coming into today, what happened on Wednesday night, looking there at Judah and Israel are both coming off of relatively strong rulers in Amaziah there in Judah and Joash or Jehoash, depending on the spelling in Israel. All right. So we'll just kind of plug along here and we'll catch the slides up when they're ready for it. But both of those kings we say are strong kings. Both had some relatively profound, for at least their recent history, military success. Amaziah there in Judah was able to go down and completely wipe out Edom and take control of that. And then Joash, we had the story where he beat the arrows on the ground 3 times and then was told he would have 3 victories over the Syrians. But then Judah kind of got full of themselves after going and wiping out Edom and decided we're not done yet and wanted to go fight Israel. And Israel kind of put an end to that pretty quickly there. So Amaziah decides he's going to go challenge Joash. Joash kind of kicks his butt, takes him prisoner, marches him back to Jerusalem, completely wrecks the city. And then I don't know if it's just to rub it in his face more or out of some kind of mercy, just leaves him there in his own wrecked capital and leaves to go back home. So then at the end of Wednesday, Joash returns home and some amount of time later for some undisclosed reasons he passes away. That's just kind of the end of what we get told about Joash. Amaziah lives for about 15 more years there in his own ruined capital, but it's actually not real ruling, so to say, is for the vast majority of that time, it's believed. He's actually on the run from his own people who really were not happy with him for some of the decisions he made there at the end of his reign. And so that's where we left off Wednesday night. And so where does that kind of put us today? So for looking at the list of the kings of Israel, was a handout I believe they had at the beginning of our class several weeks ago, and there may be some spares back there on the table if you don't have one. We're looking right here at Jeroboam the second, well into the second half of the kingdom of Israel here. He reigned for about 41 years, which in and of itself is about 1/5 of the total time of there being a separate northern kingdom altogether. And then we are to a point now where at the end of his rule, there is less than 100 years left for Israel before they're going to be no more. And so we'll look at Jeroboam first this morning, will be the plan. He is the third out of the four promised descendants of Jehu to sit on the throne. If you remember, I think it was 2 weeks ago when we covered Jehu, he wiped out completely the house of Ahab, as he was told by the Lord and by Elisha. And as a result of doing that, as well as he did, relatively, it's hard to say that butchering several hundred people is doing a job well, but he very thoroughly eliminated the house of Ahab. And so as a result of that, he was promised that for 4 generations his descendants would sit on the throne. And so here Jeroboam is going to be the third of those 4. As we said, he reigned for about 41 years. That is the longest span of any of the northern kings, by almost another 20 years. I think it's 18 years longer than the second closest person. So quite an accomplishment, especially considering how short of a reign some of these kings had to begin with. Very quickly we're told, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, followed in the sins of who? Jeroboam the son of Nebat, just like every other king of the north so far. As Scott, sorry, that's too weird. I know most of you will know him as Scott. I've been calling him Dad for 26 years. I don't know that I can change that for this morning. As he mentioned on Wednesday, that should be relatively memorized by now. And if it's not, then it will be by the end of the next couple of kings. So we'll get into a little closer here. What exactly did Jeroboam do? So the very beginning of Jeroboam's story here in 2 Kings 14, we pick him up in verse 23. He comes in about the 15th year of Amaziah, so the king that we discussed on Wednesday. He comes in towards about the middle of his rule and reigned for 41 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. But it says that he was kind of given by God the ability to save and deliver Israel from what is described as heavy affliction. It said it was not yet time for God to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, and so he sent Jeroboam and propped him up and allowed him to be successful here. So he had profound economic and military growth. He built Israel up. He took back all of the land that any of his predecessors had owned from the Syrians, from anything they lost to Judah or the Philistines or any of these surrounding nations. He got all of that land back for Israel, built up a really good economy, had very strong trade agreements with the surrounding nations, and on any secular scale was a very successful and good ruler. But that carries very little weight. Usually when it comes to God's kingdom, how well you do without turning to him is usually pretty insignificant. And so the other thing that he did, he had really profound spiritual decay in Israel, led the people in all sorts of idolatry and in bad practice, really propped themselves up really well and completely turned away from the Lord. From anything that they were doing before, they turned even farther away here. He did reign through the time of 3 of the minor prophets. Some people say maybe 4 because we don't have a set for real certain date for when Joel was written or when he lived. Some people kind of accredit his reign or his time through the time of Jeroboam. I don't exactly think that that's correct. But there are 3 that are pretty, without a doubt, prophesying and working through the reign of Jeroboam here. We have Hosea, Amos, and Jonah. And of course, Hosea and Amos both primarily prophesied about the downfall of Israel, the surrounding nations because of their wickedness and misbehaviors. And then Jonah had his deal at the very beginning. Let me back up here. Jonah had his at the very beginning kind of told Jeroboam about the success he was going to have, but then he went and had his whole deal with the whale in Nineveh in that whole story. And so all three of those kind of link back to Jeroboam there. And that's all we really know about Jeroboam. There's not a whole lot other than he took back all the land, he was a wicked guy, and then we get references to him through these prophets. But so looking here at this map, if you can see in it all detailed, the dotted lines around there in Israel, and then in the bottom, that center portion of Judah, is what would have been their territory at the start of his reign. And then the solid line around the outside would have been all of the things that he took back for Israel. And then on the bottom there, things that were controlled by Judah towards the end of that reign. But all of it would have been Jeroboam's sphere of influence, whether he had it under economic or political control. That would have been all of the land of Israel at the end of Jeroboam's reign. So then we'll transition over here, and we'll actually spend the vast majority of our time talking about Judah and the southern kingdom today. So again, we'll look at this. When are we in Judah? We're right here with Uzziah, who ends up almost smack dab in the middle of the history of the kingdom of Judah. He is the 10th king out of 20. There are about 146 years of history for Judah before he starts his reign, and about 149 years afterwards. So just shy of perfect, middle of the road Judean history here. He was mostly good, reigned for 52 years, which happens to be the second longest of any of the kings of Judah. So right off the bat, if we're looking here in 2 Kings, we're introduced to this man, Azariah, which, if you will note, just on that last slide, we had him listed as Uzziah. And so kind of what's the difference here? They are most definitely, without a doubt, the same person. Both are listed as the son of Amaziah that took the throne at 16 years of age, that reigned for 52 years. It really is just a difference of how they record his name here. And there are kind of three relatively believable, in my opinion, theories as to why we have two separate names here. A lot of the Catholic scholars, primarily, would tell you that it was a copyist error from early biblical times when they were copying down the records of these books. I don't know that I really believe that. I feel like if we were having copyist errors, we'd see a whole lot more of them than just one guy's name. If you look at the original Hebrew, we see that the book of Kings kind of originated from the northern nation. The book of Chronicles originated more from the southern nation. And so in Israel, it says they would call him Uzziah with a revelation in his heart. And there's the Hebrew for that in yellow. And in Judah, they would have known him by his given name of Uzziah. So if you look at the Hebrew there, they're all very similar. Just Uzziah there, and then there's just the backwards R in the center there for the King's translation that changes it to Azariah. And then the other thing would have been what I kind of think plays in with the second there as well, is that it was a given name versus a regal name. The name he was born with versus the name he kind of took on when he took the throne, which I believe to be kind of the most likely there, a mixture there of the difference from what they called him in the Israelite nation and versus what they called him being his given and regal names there. All right, so we'll talk about Uzziah here is what we'll refer to him as, and what all of the text in Chronicles refers to him as. So he takes the throne at 16 years of age, reigned for about 52 years before he died. So he lived to be about 68-ish, a little give or take a little bit here. I can't possibly imagine having a 16-year-old today running a country, let alone back then. But at the time, 16 years would have been roughly the recommended marrying age for that civilization and in that time frame. So not super abnormal there. As we said, he had the second longest reign in Judah. Can anybody off the top of your head tell me who had the longest? Yeah, Manasseh, that's right. And he only had him beat by about 3 years. Manasseh being one of, if not the worst kings of Judah, reigned for 55 years. And so slightly beats him out here. He was raised up by the people to replace his father. Remember Amaziah there, after he turned away from the Lord and started worshiping the idols. The people were not happy with him, and so he had to go out, and he was on the run for a good portion there of the latter part of his life. And so Uzziah would have been a co-regent with him, would have been put on the throne there in the capital and in Jerusalem while his father was on the run and in hiding from all of his people. And he was mostly good. We'll read the last kind of reference here we'll look at in the King's passages before really diving into his story in 2 Chronicles, looking at in chapter 15, verse 3. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. And again, I'll point back to Wednesday. We talked about how Amaziah did what the Lord wanted, but he didn't do it with a full heart. We get that direct comparison to David with Amaziah, how he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but not like his father David. David was called a man after God's own heart. But so Amaziah did the right things, but didn't really have the heart and the reasoning invested behind his actions there. And so we see the same here with Uzziah. Is mostly good, did what he was supposed to do for the most part, but didn't really have the invested emotional backing and all of that behind it. And so then we will turn over to 2 Chronicles for the remaining portion of our study this morning, in chapter 26. All right. And so he sought the Lord and prospered, as we're told there in verse 5, instructed him in the fear of the Lord, and as long as he sought the Lord, the Lord God made him prosper. And so we see here he did a lot of very similar things to what Jeroboam has done in the north. Lots of military victories over the surrounding nations. Specifically, we're told the Philistines and the Arabians and the Meunites, and then he subdued the Ammonites to where they were paying tithe to him. It just goes on to talk about the army that he had and these great mighty men that numbered 307,500 that went and waged these wars with him, and they did so in cycles. But he wasn't just out fighting, he was also shoring up at home. He built great fortifications, and we'll read here, starting up in verse 9 there of chapter 26. Moreover, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate and at the valley gate and the angle, and he fortified them, and he built towers in the wilderness, and he got down many cisterns or wells because he had large herds. So he puts up towers, he puts them at all the gates, he puts them at all the corners of the walls, and then we read a little bit later that he not only just puts these towers up for people to look out of, he puts weapons on them, described as great machines to throw boulders, so what we would think of as a catapult. and big machines to shoot arrows, or what we would think of as a ballista. And so having defensive weaponry here is kind of the first time we're explicitly told that somebody put these in place. And then he also had good economic and political success as well. We're told, we'll continue reading here. We'll pick back up in verse 10. Built towers and fortified them in the wilderness and cut out many wells, for he had large herds, both in Shephelah and in the plain. And he had farmers and vine dressers in the hills and in the fertile lands, for he loved the soil. So usually you get one or the other when it comes to rulers. They're either really prosperous and internal, they focus on developing the country, or they're very militaristic and go out and focus on conquering land and increasing the land mass of the country. We get a little bit of both here with Azariah. And so then we kind of see here, actually I do want to go back here. I'm going to read, we'll look at verse 8, and in verse 15 we kind of get the same thing about Uzziah here. So his fame spread as far as Egypt, for he became exceedingly strong. He builds up a good reputation all the way down to the Egyptian border. I should have put the map in here a second time, but that's a good bit farther down than Judah had at the time, and he extends that all the way down to the bodies of water that are kind of on the outside of Egypt there. And then in verse 15, so his fame spread far and wide because he was marvelously helped until he became strong. And so he, again, builds this great reputation, but we're told he had marvelously helped. The Lord helped him to build all of this because, as we talked about, he sought the Lord first and prospered because of it. Well, I think it's, even today, a pretty common thing for people to kind of get ahead of themselves in their own success, and that's exactly what we see happen here with Uzziah. And so we are actually going to try and read this whole section here because I like the way it plays out. So we'll start in verse 16 and we'll read here through the end of the chapter. But when he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. For he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. But Azariah the priest went in after him with 80 priests of the Lord, who were mighty men of valor. And they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests." So before we continue here, very quickly, he enters the temple to burn incense, what are the two reasons that he shouldn't be doing this here? One we already read, it's the priest's job to do the offerings, but what else is he doing here that he's not supposed to be doing? Entering that portion of the temple at all, really. It was a priest's only, you're not supposed to be in here. And so they go in and they kind of step between him, stop him from trying to do what he's doing, and they try to turn him away here. But as we continue here, we're going to see that doesn't really go over very well with Uzziah. And so picking up again there, the later half of verse 18. But it is for the sons of Aaron who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have done wrong, and it will bring you no honor from the Lord God. And then Uzziah was angry, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And when he became angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead in the presence of the priests in the house of the Lord by the altar. And so I kind of read that, and he is angry. He's holding this tool, and seems like he's getting ready to attack these priests. They're trying to keep him from what he's wanting to do. Now, we're not actually told that he goes to strike anybody, but this warrior king that we've got here has got something in his hand, and he's getting pretty angry at these guys. I can only imagine that he's standing there about ready to start bashing people with this tool that was meant for worship, and is punished accordingly. So he's struck with leprosy right on his forehead. Now, we all know leprosy is not a fun disease. Nobody wants to have that. But to get it right on the middle of your face, in your forehead, I can only imagine, aside from how painful that would be, how humiliating it would be to just anybody that sees you. There's no hiding that at all. And so we'll continue there in verse 20. Azariah, the chief priest, and all of the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead, and they rushed him out quickly. And he himself hurried to get out, because the Lord had struck him, and the king Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death. So very quickly here we get reinforced again how bad of an idea it is to wrong God, the priests of the Lord, especially in the temple of the Lord. He does not put up with that at all. And we get a good taste again here of how the Lord will defend his people and will always do right by his. So they get Uzziah to flee from the temple, and he has to go back to his house there. And so, and King Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death, and being a leper, lived in a separate house, for he was excluded from the house of the Lord. And Jotham his son was over the king's house and governed the people of the land. So he spends the entirety of the rest of his life in isolation, separate house from his family, not able to see any of his people, not able to make any decisions, or even really interact with anybody. And so in the same way that he served on the throne while his dad was running away and in hiding from the people, his son is going to have to sit here on the throne in his stead while he has to be hidden away from the people due to his leprosy. And so we get some good mirroring there of how both Uzziah and Amaziah, his father, were good men, but that did some wrong and were punished for it. Yes, Paula?
Sam, he didn't seem to repent and ask for forgiveness or try to get the leprosy reversed. I mean, he had done what God wanted up until that point, and then he never tried to fix it, it doesn't seem like.
Right. For anybody that couldn't hear, she was pointing out that we're never told even then that he even tried to turn around and repent and get the leprosy removed or move forward from that. He did all of the right things until he didn't, and then he just didn't try to fix his mistakes either. And I wonder sometimes if that might be spawned from a bit of embarrassment. I mean, here he was riding on the top of the world. All of his military conquests were successful. His people were thriving because of the decisions he made. And then he goes and makes a mistake. And we do see there, when they're chasing him out of the temple, it acknowledges, yeah, he left in a hurry because the Lord had struck him. And I think that's pretty clear. He knew that the Lord was angry with him for what he did. But I know that for myself personally, at least, when people go say, hey, you really shouldn't have done that, it's not always easy to eat a slice of humble pie like that, and perhaps a good bit of this pride that is built up over the first portion of his life has prevented him from seeing that and repenting. That's a good point. But so I didn't put the slide in here to draw these parallels, but I want to draw a couple of them between Jeroboam and Uzziah here. In the same way that the previous kings for each country kind of paralleled each other one for one, so do Uzziah and Jeroboam here. Jeroboam takes the throne following a strong ruler, his father, and continues to be a strong ruler. Uzziah takes the throne behind his father, who was a strong ruler and continues to have a strong reign here. Both were militarily successful in taking land that had been theirs, that had been chipped away over the kings before them. Both brought economic growth to their respective countries, and both of them ended up on the wrong side of the Lord at the end of their reign. So we've got just a little bit, about 15 minutes here to continue. There are a couple of extra fun notes that are not necessarily fun, but not super related to anything significant with the story or going forward into any of the other kings. But archaeologically, Uzziah, we have several things that mention Uzziah that have been brought up archaeologically, both from the Syrians, some of the other surrounding nations, as well as from Judah here. They found this would be the gravestone of Uzziah that has been found, and it actually translates here to hither were brought the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah, not to be opened. This stone is dated itself, but it's not dated until 700 years after the time that Uzziah would have been in power. So a couple of reasons for that is either his tomb was kind of redecorated after they got back from captivity, or he was entirely reburied and had a reburial there for him when they got back for that. And then another kind of fun thing that we have some secular confirmation of for the time of Uzziah. Both Amos and Zechariah refer to the earthquake of the day of Uzziah, or in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Amos refers back to it, and then Zechariah prophesied about an earthquake to come like in the days of Uzziah. We actually have geologists that have studied the area have found a lot of evidence that would point to a pretty decent size earthquake. It's about an 8.0 on the Richter scale earthquake that would have hit around within a 50-ish year period that lines up right with somewhere in Uzziah's reign. And kind of a fun theory that I don't really have any kind of backing for, but that I read in several places, is that several people think that this earthquake may have been directly linked to when Uzziah went into the temple to offer that incense, thinking that as a part of God's reaction and his anger with Uzziah, he caused this earthquake and struck him with leprosy. Again, we don't have any actual factual or scriptural information that points to that, but having this massive earthquake in that time definitely matches God's kind of MO of having great anger and shaking the earth and things like that. And so that kind of is our story of Uzziah and Jeroboam. They're both relatively long-reigning kings that we have relatively little information about. They're pretty much stopgaps in a story, it seems like, of, well, they were here, they fought these people, they grew this kind of business, and they moved on. Other things of note here. We talked a little bit about how Hosea and Amos were both prophets here that actively interacted with the kingdom at the time. Jonah, active during this time, as we said, he kind of prophesied to Jeroboam at the beginning of his reign and then did his spiel. Hosea seemed more so to interact with the king, with Jeroboam, and Amos more so with the people, and less so with Jeroboam himself. And so if we look at Hosea in any depth here, it's essentially, we get the story of Hosea and his wife and children, how he's married to this woman. They have several children together. She becomes unfaithful to him. And we get a story here where the Lord sends him, instead of writing her off and wishing her ill, go back to her, recommit your love to her. And we get that story there as a direct parallel of how the Lord has interacted both with Israel and Judah here. We see time and time again after the marriage of God and his people at Mount Sinai, when he gives them the 10 Commandments, that they break the covenant, they go to follow idols, and then the Lord, instead of wiping them out and washing his hands, continually will go back and continue to be there for them and take them back when they turn around. And we get that parallel here in a story of Hosea and his wife. And then we start to see kind of the rest of the book of Hosea is prophecies of punishment and curses on a bunch of nations here. He prophesies punishment coming for Israel and for Judah, that over and over again the Lord will punish Israel, the Lord will punish Israel, the Lord will punish Judah a little bit, the Lord will punish Israel, the Lord will punish Israel. And then as we get to the end of Hosea, we get, well, the Lord still loves Israel, and we get a little glimmer of hope at the end, and kind of gives us the overarching story of what's going to happen for the rest of the nation here. They're going to start their decline. They're going to be harassed by all these people around them. They're going to be wiped out. But then there's this promise that the Lord will still be there to come back to his people. And then in Amos, we get a lot of the same kind of, God's going to judge you for this, but it's not necessarily pointed all at Israel like Hosea is. It's targeted at the nations around Israel. Forgive me here. I have my one bookmark set, and so I gotta get over here to Amos by hand. And so the Lord, through Amos, pronounces judgment on all of Israel's neighbors here. Let's see. 3 transgressions for Damascus, for Gaza. He does talk a little bit more again here, prophesying against Judah, a little bit against Israel, against Syria and the Philistines. We see all of Israel's neighbors kind of say, well, hey, you're not doing right, but all of the people around you are also going to get punished for doing the same wrong things that you're doing. And then Amos does kind of talk to the people a little bit about how Israel has not returned to the Lord, gives the people a little bit of a, hey, you're going to be punished for this, but then kind of gives them instructions of seek the Lord and live, giving them the direction. Here's the direction you are going, heading for punishment, and this is what you're going to get. Here's the direction you should be going to avoid that and to come behind it. And so then Amos actually prophesies about the destruction of Israel and the restoration of Israel as well. Since we have a little bit of time, I'll go ahead and tell the story of Jonah. I didn't know if we'd have time to go over it or not, and since he kind of worked out of country the whole time, I was going to leave it out, but we've got a few minutes here. So most of us have grown up hearing the story of Jonah, who was a prophet and got sent to go talk to the people of Nineveh. But Jonah was the prophet that didn't want to do what God told him. He said, you go to Nineveh, and he booked a ship to go the opposite direction as far as he could possibly go to Tarshish. While he's on the boat, even the sailors of the boat are more, I almost want to say more righteous. They follow the Lord in a better way than Jonah does. While he's sleeping under the boat, and they have this great storm, they find out, oh, this is a man of God, what's going on? And he said, well, just throw me overboard, and your problems will be solved. A lot of times it's kind of portrayed as a selfless decision of throw me overboard to save yourselves. But while I was kind of looking at it, I had the thought of, well, that is much more, selfish than anything for a man that's trying to get out of having to go to Nineveh. Throw me over and let me drown in the sea is going to keep him from having to go to Nineveh if he doesn't want to. But then even as they're throwing him overboard, the sailors, of course, are crying out to God, don't let his blood be on our hands. And we see that just these sailors, these unnamed sailors are being more faithful and trying to reach out to the Lord more so than Jonah is. And he gets swallowed by the big fish or the whale and spends some time in the stomach of this aquatic animal. We don't know exactly, fish or whale, either way, until he kind of comes to his senses and says, all right, I give up. You're right, God. I'll do what you told me to do. And of course, we know the story. He gets vomited back up by the whale on the sea. And so he goes to Nineveh, but he's still not very happy about having to go to Nineveh or very happy at all about the fact that God is trying to save Nineveh. So he goes into Nineveh and essentially says, you guys have got 40 days before you're going to be upturned, which in his mind is thinking you're going to be wiped off the face of the planet, you're going to be destroyed in 40 days. But kind of the exact opposite happens here. It says, after just the minimal amount of effort that Jonah put in there in Nineveh, everybody repented, even the cows of Nineveh repented. And so while he's stormed off and puts himself up on a mountain or on a hill outside the city waiting to watch the fireworks and the fire and brimstone that he thinks is coming for Nineveh, they're all in the city doing what they're supposed to be now after his reluctant lesson. And so we get a little bit of the story of the vine plant that the Lord causes to grow to give him shade, and then he takes it away and has the worms that eat the roots and kill the plant. And over and over and over again, Jonah just tells the Lord, please just kill me so I don't have to see you save and forgive people that have been so wrong here. And we get a good lesson here in that the Lord is a forgiving God. And so even these supposedly the most terrible of terrible people, I always laugh. In the VeggieTales movie, they depict this story. They're slapping people with fishes. It's always kind of made me chuckle. But so the Lord saves Nineveh, and that's kind of the story of our two kings for today and the three prophets that were kind of active during this time frame. I don't know who's got Wednesday night. I want to say it's Ben or maybe Darrell. But either way, please feel free to come back Wednesday night to continue the story.